Ever wonder why something happening way up north, like a Canadian election, could actually have a real impact on your day-to-day life? Maybe what you pay at the pump, or, the price of groceries, even that show you just binged.
Right. It seems distant, but it's really not.
Exactly. So today we're diving deep into exactly that, why Canada's upcoming election isn't just Canadian news. Well, it's American news, too.
Absolutely.
You sent in your questions about this whole U.S.-Canada connection, and we're tackling a big one. How do those votes in Canada actually affect us down here?
And there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, we're going to explore the surprising links in trade, energy security, even entertainment. We're drawing on the sources you share that really show how, well, tangled our two countries are.
Deeply intertwined.
So our mission today, pretty simple. Give you the crucial insights so you understand why what happens in those Canadian polling booths truly matters right here at home.
Okay, so where should we start? I think the economy is probably the most immediate thing people feel.
Makes sense.
What's immediately striking is just the sheer scale of it all. Canada isn't just a trading partner for the U.S.
No, it's the largest, right?
The largest. We're talking nearly $2 billion in goods and services.
Yeah.
Crossing that border every single day.
$2 billion a day. That's staggering.
It really is. Think about that. And in 2023 alone, the total trade was over $800 billion.
Wow.
So, when Canada makes a policy change, it's not happening in some vacuum. It sends very real ripples through American communities. It impacts businesses, consumers, jobs all across the country.
Okay, let's unpack that ripple effect then.
Yeah.
When we talk trade, the USMCA, the deal that replaced NAFTA, that's the big one, isn't it?
That's the framework, yeah.
So how could a Canadian election actually change how that works?
Well, that's the key question, isn't it? The USMCA, it did modernize trade rules, but it isn't necessarily permanent. It's not set in stone.
Oh,
Several Canadian political parties have actually talked about, potentially reviewing it, maybe strengthening parts or even renegotiating bits of it.
Really? Renegotiating?
Potentially. So if you connect this to the bigger picture, a new government up there could very well lead to some pretty significant shifts in the terms of trade between us.
Like what specifically?
Well, take cars, for example. The USMCA updated rules around auto manufacturing, where parts have to come from. A renegotiation could mess with those rules again.
Which would hit production prices.
Yeah.
Both sides of the border.
Exactly. It cascades down.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, I think. We've got different parties in Canada, and they seem to have pretty different ideas.
Oh, definitely.
So what could a conservative government, maybe under Poilievre, what could that mean for the U.S. economy, trade-wise?
Yeah, so the conservative platform generally talks about fewer regulations, right? And actively encouraging natural resource development.
Okay.
So what that could mean for the U.S. is potentially greater access for American companies wanting to do business in Canada.
Easier to do that?
Maybe. Their stated goal is cutting red tape, lowering taxes, trying to spur economic activity.
So, give me an example.
Okay, imagine if Canadian regulations on cross-border trucking were maybe eased up a bit. We might see faster, maybe cheaper delivery of goods. That could potentially lower prices for you on some things.
Gotcha. And then on the other side, what about Trudeau's Liberals? If they stay in or another Liberal government comes in, what's their likely approach?
Well, historically, the Liberals have really emphasized putting strong environmental provisions into trade agreements.
Okay, so environment is key for them.
Very much so.
Oh.
And this could affect American industries, things like auto manufacturing again, agriculture, forestry.
How so?
Well, it could mean adjustments, changes in production processes, tweaks to supply chains to meet potentially tougher Canadian environmental standards for goods crossing the border.
So maybe stricter emission standards on certain Canadian exports coming here.
That's the kind of thing, yeah.
And then there's the NDP with Jagmeet Singh. They tend to have a different focus again, don't they? How might their policies hit the U.S. economically?
Absolutely different focus. The NDP typically pushes for even stronger labor protections and environmental rules.
Even tougher than the Liberals.
Generally, yes. So this could mean even stricter standards for U.S. companies operating in Canada or trying to export there. It adds another layer of complexity, potentially cost, to that trade relationship.
Okay. Now let's zoom in on something specific that I think a lot of people notice, maybe if they cross the border. Dairy.
Ah, yes. Dairy.
It always seems to be a point of friction. What's the story there? And how could the election change things?
It's fascinating, really. Canada has the system called supply management for dairy.
Supply management. Okay.
Imagine if the Canadian government basically told every farm how much milk they could produce.
They set quotas.
Exactly. And then they slap a huge tax on milk or cheese or butter coming in from the U.S. That's essentially what it is.
Wow.
It controls production, keeps domestic prices high, and it relies on these massive tariffs, like we're talking 300% on imported dairy sometimes.
300%. No wonder U.S. farmers aren't happy.
Right. It costs American dairy farmers billions in potential exports they just can't make.
So could an election actually change that?
It could be a turning point. Maybe. A new government might be more willing to ease those restrictions, open up the Canadian market a bit more to U.S. dairy.
Which could mean lower prices down here for cheese, butter.
Potentially, yeah. Or they could decide to double down, protect their own industry even more, keep those high tariffs right where they are.
So the price of my cheese at the grocery store could actually be influenced by who Canadians vote for.
It's a pretty direct link, isn't it?
Yeah, that's really direct. Okay, what about lumber? Housing costs are just a massive issue in the U.S. right now. Does Canada play a big role there?
Oh, absolutely. A huge role.
Huh?
Canada supplies something like 80% of all the softwood lumber the U.S. imports.
80%. So basically most of the wood for new houses.
Pretty much. It's fundamental for building homes. And there's this decades-long fight, the softwood lumber dispute.
Right, I've heard of that.
Yeah, American producers basically argue that Canadian lumber is unfairly subsidized by their government.
Okay.
And the Canadian government's position on that, which is definitely influenced by who's in power, directly affects the cost of building homes right across the U.S.
So a more protectionist Canadian government.
Could lead to higher lumber prices here, yeah, making housing affordability even tougher.
Okay, let's switch gears again. Another vital resource. Energy. Canada is a major energy supplier for the U.S., isn't it?
That's right, huge. Canada is our #1 source of foreign oil.
#1. Bigger than Saudi Arabia or Mexico.
Bigger than anyone else. We get roughly 60% of our crude oil imports from Canada.
60%? Wow.
Yeah. And remember the whole Keystone XL pipeline drama?
Oh, yeah. Contentious.
Exactly. Even though it got canceled in the end, it really just highlighted how complex and how critical this energy relationship is.
And they have those huge oil sands in Alberta, right?
Massive reserves.
Yeah.
But, they also come with significant environmental questions and concerns.
So how do the different Canadian parties generally approach energy policy, and how could that ripple down to, what we pay for gas or heating here?
Right. This is where the party platforms really show different paths. If parties like the Greens or the NDP gain more influence, you could see stronger environmental regulations put on those oil sands,
Which could mean...
potentially increasing the cost to produce that oil. And, well, that could eventually mean higher prices for American consumers at the pump or for heating oil.
Okay. And the other side, the Conservatives.
They generally favor fast-tracking energy projects, more pipelines, more development.
So potentially more supply coming to the U.S.
That's the idea, which could potentially lower costs for consumers here. They've actually promised to repeal something called Bill C-69.
What's that?
Critics called it the No More Pipelines Act. It basically increased the environmental and regulatory review process for big energy projects. So repealing it signals a very different approach.
A very clear difference there. You mentioned earlier that, 98% of Canada's energy exports come to the U.S.?
Yeah, 98%. It's an incredible level of interdependence.
So it's like, we depend on them, they depend on us.
Exactly. It creates the situation of mutual leverage, really. Canada relies heavily on the U.S. market for its energy sales.
And we rely heavily on their supply.
Right. So election outcomes in Ottawa, they can have pretty immediate, pretty noticeable effects on energy markets right here.
So when you're filling up your car or paying your heating bill, decisions made way up there really do matter down here.
They really do. It's not abstract at all.
And it's not just oil and gas, is it? I think I remember reading our electricity grids are linked up too.
Exactly. Highly integrated electrical grid. Power generated from Canadian hydro facilities, especially in places like Quebec, British Columbia.
Lots of hydropower there.
Tons. And it flows directly into American cities, powers homes, and businesses here. And the agreements that govern all that, the regulations, the trade deals underpinning it, all of that can be influenced by the priorities of whoever forms the next Canadian government.
Okay. Wow. All right. Let's shift focus again. Something that's always a topic of discussion. The border.
The famous 49th parallel. Well, most of it.
Right. It's famously long, famously undefended. But how does a Canadian election actually factor into our security, maybe our immigration situation?
That's a critical point. While it is the longest undefended border, technically,
Hmm.
it's certainly not unmonitored.
Right. There's still security.
Absolutely. Before the pandemic hit, we were seeing over 300,000 crossings every single day. People, goods, everything.
300,000 a day.
Yeah. Now, Canada's immigration system, it often gets talked about here, sometimes held up by U.S. politicians as this ideal points-based or merit-focused model.
I've heard that comparison.
But what's particularly relevant for this discussion is how Canada's actual policies, especially regarding refugees and asylum seekers, how those can change quite a bit depending on which party's in charge in Ottawa.
You mentioned Roxham Road earlier when we were prepping. Could you explain what that was about and why it matters for this U.S.-Canada link?
Yeah, Roxham Road. It was basically an unofficial but very well-known crossing point between New York State and Quebec.
Unofficial, so people just walked across.
Essentially, yeah, to make asylum claims in Canada. And what happened was when the U.S. tightened up its policies, particularly at the southern border,
Okay.
there was a really noticeable increase in people using crossings like Roxham Road to seek asylum in Canada instead.
So U.S. policy shifts push people north?
It certainly appeared that way, and it created a huge political debate inside Canada. Different parties had very different ideas about how to handle it, stricter enforcement versus more humanitarian approaches.
So the takeaway for us.
The key takeaway is that Canadian border policies, how they choose to manage their border and asylum system, can directly influence migration patterns across the whole continent, including affecting the U.S. It's all connected.
And the pandemic, the border closures during COVID.
Yeah.
That really drove home how vital that daily cross-border flow is for the towns right there, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Those restrictions, which were just unprecedented in modern times, they caused real economic hardship. Serious pain for communities on both sides.
Yeah, I remember reading about places like Blaine, Washington.
Blaine, Washington, all the way over to Calais, Maine. Businesses, families, individuals who relied on just being able to pop back and forth daily. They felt it very, very acutely.
So it really highlighted that deep economic link in those border zones.
Totally underscored it. So future decisions by the next Canadian government about how they manage that border, integrating new tech, security cooperation levels, all that will have really tangible effects on American communities right along that northern border.
It's not all about dollars and cents and security checks, though, is it?
Sure.
I mean, we share a lot culturally. How could a Canadian election actually affect, say, the TV shows we watch or the music we hear?
That's a great point. The cultural connection's huge, obviously. We share so much media, so much entertainment, sports.
Right. Hockey leagues, actors.
Exactly. But, and this is the interesting part, Canadian cultural policies, things like specific content requirements, various government subsidies, they directly influence what actually gets produced in Canada. And therefore, what eventually becomes available for American audiences to watch or listen to.
So those rules you hear about, needing a certain percentage of Canadian content on the radio or TV.
CanCon, right?
CanCon, exactly. How do those actually end up shaping the shows we might know down here?
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is that those requirements and the financial incentives often tied to them, they've definitely played a role in getting some really popular shows made that found big audiences here.
Like what?
Well, think about Schitt's Creek. Hugely popular here, very Canadian. The Handmaid's Tale. Okay, American story, but filmed extensively in Canada using Canadian crews, locations.
Right, I knew it filmed there.
And older shows like Orphan Black. These policies helped make them happen.
So different parties might have different views on those rules. Oh, yeah. Some might advocate for strengthening CanCon rules, to further promote Canadian stories and talent. Others might argue for a more open market, less regulation.
And those choices ultimately affect what we see on our screens.
They can influence the diversity of stories, the perspectives that reach American viewers, absolutely.
And I've also heard that Hollywood often chooses to film in Canada, right? Is that also a policy thing?
Yes, absolutely. Big time. Provinces like British Columbia, Vancouver especially, and Ontario around Toronto, they offer really attractive tax incentives, tax credits, other benefits for film and TV productions.
So it's cheaper for Hollywood studios to film there.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
Significantly. So changes to those provincial incentive programs, which could definitely happen after an election depending on the government's priorities,
Yeah.
that could shift where major movies and TV series decide to film.
Which impacts local economies there.
Huge impact. But also, indirectly, maybe even the kinds of stories that get told or where they're set.
Fascinating. Okay, let's zoom out a bit now. Look at the bigger political picture. The relationship between, say, President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau. Well, complex feels like an understatement.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly.
Why does that personal dynamic between the leaders of the U.S. and Canada actually matter so much? It feels like it shouldn't, but it does.
It really does. In international relations, especially between two countries as incredibly closely linked as ours are, that personal relationship at the top can have a surprisingly significant impact.
How so?
Well, the Trump era definitely showed that, didn't it? Public disagreements, throwing barbs back and forth, trade disputes getting personal.
Yeah, Trump calling Trudeau dishonest and weak.
Exactly. That kind of stuff can either escalate tensions or, if the rapport is good, leaders can manage disagreements more effectively behind the scenes. It sets the tone.
So if we see a new government in Canada, and potentially, different administrations here in the U.S. in the future, maybe even Trump returning, what kind of shifts in that overall political relationship might we expect?
Yeah, that brings up some really important possibilities. For instance, a conservative government in Canada, say under Poilievre, might find more alignment with a Republican administration here on certain issues.
Like what? Energy, regulation.
Exactly. Energy development, deregulation. Poilievre's generally sort of pro-business stance could definitely resonate with some Republican economic priorities.
But maybe friction on other things, social issues.
Could be. There might still be differences there. On the flip side, a more progressive government in Canada, maybe Liberal or NDP-led, might experience more friction, more tension with a conservative U.S. administration.
Okay. It sounds like Canadian politicians are probably already wargaming these scenarios, thinking ahead about potential changes down here, too.
Oh, absolutely. That's standard practice. Canadian politicians, diplomats, they often have what they call two-track strategies.
Two-track, meaning?
Meaning they prepare for different potential outcomes in U.S. elections. They game out how they'd work with either party in the White House to make sure they can maintain a strong, productive relationship, regardless of who wins here.
Because that relationship is just too important to leave to chance.
It's always the top foreign policy priority for Canada. Always. But how they approach it, the specific tactics, can vary quite a bit depending on the ideological matchup between Ottawa and Washington.
Okay, now traditionally, Canada and the U.S. have been pretty much in lockstep on major global issues, right? Like within NATO, for example.
Yeah, a very long history of close alignment, especially within NATO and recently on things like support for Ukraine.
But are we seeing any potential for that alignment to maybe shift depending on who wins in Canada?
Well, while that history is strong, we have seen some areas where, let's say, cracks have appeared in recent years, some divergence.
Like where?
Canada's approach to China, for instance, issues like Huawei's 5G involvement or how they handled the detention of the two Michaels.
Right, the two Canadians China detained.
Yeah. Their approach was sometimes seen as maybe less confrontational than the U.S. stance at the time. Climate change is another big one.
How so?
Canada generally has set more ambitious carbon reduction targets than, say, the U.S. under Trump, or even compared to current U.S. targets in some ways.
So potential friction point there, depending on who's in power where.
Definitely. And then there's the perennial issue, defense spending.
The NATO 2% target.
Exactly. Canada currently spends around, 1.3% of its GDP on defense, well below the NATO target. And the U.S. consistently brings this up, puts pressure on allies to spend more.
Do the Canadian parties differ on that?
Yes. It's worth noting the Conservative Party has indicated a commitment to increasing defense spending significantly, which could potentially ease some of that specific tension with the U.S., especially a U.S. administration focused on burden sharing.
So the political direction Canada takes could really influence its role on the world stage and how it partners with the U.S. on those big global challenges.
Precisely. Canada is often seen as this trusted, like-minded ally. That can be a huge asset when the U.S. is trying to build international coalitions or seeks support for initiatives. A shift in Canada's foreign policy priorities, driven by an election, could either strengthen those joint efforts or, complicate them.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground: trade, energy, border, culture, politics. But I know there are still so many specific policy areas where a Canadian election could have ripples down here.
Yeah.
Climate policy seems like a huge one. with really clear cross-border impacts.
It really is. Canada's national carbon pricing system, the carbon tax, that's a signature policy of the current Liberal government.
Right, controversial up there too.
Very. And it has direct implications for industries that operate across the border, affects their competitiveness, and the different Canadian parties. They have wildly different visions for climate policy.
Right.
Well, Liberals might want to strengthen the current system. The NDP might push for even faster action. But the Conservatives, they've explicitly promised to dismantle the national carbon price altogether.
Scrap it completely.
That's the promise. So these decisions will inevitably affect manufacturing costs, energy prices again, and just the whole operating environment for any U.S. company with Canadian operations.
And what about the Arctic? You hear more and more about that region opening up due to climate change. What role does Canadian policy play there that affects us?
Yeah, Arctic sovereignty is becoming increasingly critical as climate change melts ice, opening up new shipping routes, making resources maybe more accessible.
And you've got Russia and China showing more interest up there too.
Exactly, more activity from other nations. So Canada's policies in its Arctic territory have direct implications for U.S. interests.
How so? Is there a dispute?
There is. Canada considers the Northwest Passage, that potential shipping route through its northern islands, as its internal waters.
Okay.
The U.S. doesn't recognize that claim. We view it as an international strait, open to passage.
Ah, okay. That's a key difference.
It is. So Canada's approach to security up there, any infrastructure development, how strongly it asserts its sovereignty, all that impacts U.S. northern security calculations and potential economic interests.
Gotcha. Technology policy, that's another area that's just constantly evolving everywhere.
Mm.
How might a Canadian election shape things like, say, privacy rules or how they govern AI in ways that could affect the U.S.?
That's a really important one. And moving fast. Canada's decisions on privacy regulations, how they decide to develop AI governance frameworks, even things like implementing digital services taxes on tech giants.
Those can create ripples for American tech companies.
Huge ripples. And for consumers, too. Look at the recent Online News Act in Canada, Bill C-18.
Right, where Meta started blocking news links on Facebook and Instagram up there.
Exactly. That's a prime example of how Canadian legislation can directly affect the flow of information, platform operations in our really interconnected digital world. Different Canadian parties have different ideas about how much and how to regulate big tech.
And those choices will have consequences down here.
For U.S. companies operating north of the border, definitely. And for Americans who use those platforms or consume digital content originating from or hosted in Canada.
Okay. And beyond oil and gas, Canada is also a major source of other natural resources, critical for the U.S., isn't it?
Oh, absolutely critical. Canada supplies, for example, about 50% of all the uranium the U.S. imports.
Half. Wow. For nuclear power.
Yep. And they also have substantial reserves of critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements.
The stuff needed for EV batteries, electronics, defense tech.
Exactly. Vital for electric vehicles, battery storage, defense systems, renewable energy tech like wind turbines. So the Canadian government's policies on how those resources are developed,
Right.
how they handle consultations with Indigenous communities about projects on their lands, what environmental rules they apply, all of that directly impacts the security and stability of these really crucial supply chains for the United States.
So an election could shift the approach to mining or resource extraction.
It absolutely could, affecting how quickly or under what conditions those critical minerals become available to U.S. industries.
Okay, even something like water. Managing the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
That has a cross-border element too, right?
It certainly does. The Great Lakes are this incredible shared resource. Something like 20% of the world's surface freshwater is right there.
Amazing.
And how we manage them is governed by various bilateral agreements between the U.S. and Canada. But climate change is impacting things, water levels, precipitation patterns.
Making management more complex.
Exactly. So Canadian policies on water protection, on maybe potential water exports, which is always a sensitive topic, or
Yeah.
water usage rights, those become increasingly important for the U.S.
Especially concerns about like diverting water away from the lakes.
That's always a background concern, yeah.
Yeah.
So overall water security for that whole vast region depends on cooperation and aligned policies, which elections can influence.
Man, it's almost overwhelming when you list it all out. How many different areas are so deeply connected? Even things like healthcare or financial regulations seem to have relevance across the border.
They really do. I mean, obviously, Canada's single-payer healthcare system is very different from ours, and it's a constant topic of debate here.
Right, people always compare.
But the evolution of Canadian healthcare policy, like You see some conservative-led provinces experimenting more with private delivery options within their public system. Well, those kinds of shifts and experiments can offer insights, maybe lessons, relevant to our own healthcare debates here in the U.S.
And finance.
Yeah.
Our banking systems are linked.
Very integrated. Canadian financial regulations, their approach to things like capital requirements for banks, how they manage housing market stability, which is a big issue there too.
Oh, yeah.
That can have implications for the broader North American financial landscape. People often point to how Canada's banking system seemed more resilient during the 2008 financial crisis.
All right, they didn't have the same kind of meltdown. Different regulations played a part.
That's the argument, yeah. Different regulations, different philosophy, perhaps. And different parties might tweak those regulations.
Okay, and just a couple more sectors maybe. Agriculture and pharmaceuticals. Those seem like areas where Canadian policies could hit American consumers or industries pretty directly.
Exactly right. Canada's a huge agricultural producer and exporter, so their farm policies, subsidies, environmental rules, trade stances, they directly impact food prices down here.
And they compete with U.S. farmers in global markets, too.
Big time. So election outcomes affecting Canadian ag policy matter to American farmers and consumers. And pharmaceuticals, that's another hot one.
Lower drug prices up there, right?
Generally, yes. Canada has a body, the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, that actively regulates and often leads to lower costs for prescription drugs compared to the U.S.
Which leads to Americans trying to buy drugs from Canada.
Exactly. That whole cross-border purchasing issue, the debates about drug reimportation, it's all linked. And different Canadian parties have different approaches to drug regulation, intellectual property rights, price controls.
So an election could change the landscape for drug pricing and access.
It could influence it, absolutely, affecting both Canadians and the ongoing policy debates here.
Okay, one last area you touched on earlier, Indigenous relations.
Yeah.
How does Canada's approach there, like with their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, how does that connect with the U.S. context?
Well, Canada's ongoing journey with Truth and Reconciliation, their efforts to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRAP, that's garnered a lot of international attention.
Right.
And it can certainly inform, maybe influence, the continuing dialogue and policy developments regarding Indigenous rights and sovereignty here in the United States. The approaches taken by different Canadian political parties.
On things like land claims, addressing historical wrongs, closing socioeconomic gaps.
Exactly. Those different approaches can contribute to evolving international norms and expectations in this really crucial area. It sets precedents, generates discussion.
Wow. Okay. So taking a step back from all these specifics, it is just crystal clear, isn't it? All these seemingly separate bits of our lives, the gas price, the cost of cheese, the shows we stream at night, they're actually deeply, deeply intertwined with Canadian politics and election outcomes. It's so much more than just, car parts crossing the border multiple times, or the fact that we share hockey leagues.
It really is. It's about the water in the Great Lakes. It's about maple syrup. It's aluminum. It's that softwood lumber for houses.
Yeah.
So many fundamental things.
That deep interconnectedness, that's really what makes Canadian elections so significant for Americans, isn't it?
Precisely. It's not just some matter of, distant international curiosity. It has real tangible effects on your daily life, your wallet, your economic well-being.
And even the security of our shared continent.
Absolutely.
So to kind of bring it all together then, it really hammers home the point. Canadian elections have substantial, very real consequences for Americans across just this huge range of issues: economic, security, cultural, well, just about everything we've talked about.
That's absolutely right. What happens when Canadians head to the polls has a direct, and I think often really underestimated, impact on life right here in the United States.
Yeah, underestimate is probably the right word. So maybe the next time you see a headline about Canadian politics, remember, it's not just another international news blip off somewhere else.
Yeah.
It's actually a story that's deeply connected to your own life, your own community. It makes you wonder, too, what other seemingly distant global events might be having a bigger impact on your life than you currently realize?
That's a great question to ponder.
Yeah. What new questions does this whole deep dive bring up for you about just how interconnected our world truly is becoming?
We've definitely only scratched the surface today.
Well, for sure. So what aspects of this whole U.S.-Canada relationship do you, listening right now, find the most important or maybe the most surprising? We'd love to know.
Yeah, let us know.
This deep dive, it was really designed to give you a much clearer picture of these vital, often invisible connections. We certainly hope it has.